he was not lightly esteemed, but he was in his own eyes. And that is a great place to be. And the servants of Saul told him, saying, On this manner spake David. And Saul said, Thus shall ye say to David, The king desireth not any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to be avenged of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law, and the days were not expired. Wherever David arose and went, and he and his men, and slew of the Philistines 200 men, and David brought forth their foreskins and gave them in full tale to the king, that it might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal his daughter to wife. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went forth, and it came to pass after they went forth that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by. We'll just pray this morning. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to be back here again studying this book. Lord, thank you for your Bible. Thank you for all of the words that are in it, dear God. They're all to bring us, Lord, wisdom and knowledge and to draw things from them that we can apply to our daily lives, Lord. And I just pray to help us this morning as we go through this. Just taking a quick look at this chapter, dear God, just to give us something out of your word. And I pray this in your name this morning. All right, so I find in verse number 1 through 5, we find the first part. I just broke this chapter really down into 3 parts. And like I said, as we just read this, it is a regular old drama. I mean, if you were to draw up a story that was any crazier than this, I mean, you have David, you have Saul, Jonathan, Saul's son, forming this treaty, this allegiance with David. I believe that Jonathan probably had a little bit more knowledge and wisdom and could see what God was doing in the life of David, and that is what led him to do this. And we'll get that's in verse number 4, where Jonathan really just took it upon himself. Jonathan was the heir to this throne. Jonathan was Saul's son. Jonathan would have been the man that would have taken the place under the traditions of man. Jonathan was the next in line to the throne. He was the son of the king. That's how it operated back then. They didn't have election cycles. You just basically, if you wanted a new king, either the king died and then every single man in his family died. That's pretty much how it happened. You had to kill the king's family. It was just a succession. Everybody that was the son, and then Jonathan's son would have been the king, and his son would have been the king, and so forth and so on. But God does not go by the traditions of men. God goes by his will, what he wants done. Now, Israel got a king because they wanted to go by the traditions of man. They were not satisfied anymore with the what God wanted for them. They wanted their own tradition. They wanted to be just like the world. And so God gave them what they wanted. But he gave them Saul. Saul went against God. And so God is now going to do his will, going to do it his way, going to bring forth his king. I believe that Saul was the people's king. Saul was who the people chose. David was who God chose. We go back to chapter 16 when Samuel's looking for the king, and God tells him, you're looking on the outward, I look on the inside. I see the heart. All the people can see is the outward appearance. I mean, we're getting ready to have an election, and I don't know, anyway, we're not going to get that crazy. But people will say, well, I just like this person more than the other person because I like their personality. I like the way they handle themselves better than the other person. And people will vote on what they see. They don't even though you should vote probably based on what the person's telling you, but most people just vote for people that they like, that they can see that they're maybe just like them or so forth and so on. But you couldn't see a whole lot of a king in David on the outside, but on the inside, that's what mattered. And so Jonathan was the heir to this throne, and then you see him and he forms this allegiance with David, and then you get Saul gets upset about it when the women come into Israel after they're coming out of the battle, and this probably happened over and over again when they would come back into the city. All these women came out, and they were just having a good time. They were praising that the Lord wrought another great victory in Israel, that all these people were still alive. And Saul got upset, even though it says that they came to meet King Saul with tabrets. And I don't know that they necessarily came with the intention to make Saul upset. I think they just came with the intention to speak the truth. Saul had killed his thousands, which is not a light number in reality. I mean, Saul was a man of war. Saul was a warrior, even though toward the end of his life, he probably didn't live in that power that he had because he lost it. But Saul was a warrior. He'd killed his thousands, but David had factually killed his 10,000s. He had factually killed more people. And so Saul got upset about that, though. He got mad. He got his feelings hurt because he said, I'm supposed to be the man. Look at me, look at me. And again, that's what caused his downfall. This whole idea of just look at me and what I have done, don't look at God. And then you find that Saul tried to give David a wife, and then he lied to David, basically saying that he was going to give him Merab, and then basically gave her to wife with to another man, probably another king somewhere. I'm not exactly sure who Adriel was. But then Saul finds out that Michal, his other daughter, loved David. And so we find out toward down here that he gave her to David just to be a snare to him, just to be that thorn in the flesh, just to try to get David probably to lose his power, just to lose what he had, so that Saul would look better. That's what his ultimate goal was there. And then you find that he gives him to him, and then he tries to kill. Then he tries to kill David, but because David understood that he was a nobody. He wasn't anybody. He was from Bethlehem, and the Bible talks about Bethlehem as the least. That's why when they thought the prophecy of Jesus coming through the Bethlehem, it was the least amongst the princes. It wasn't nothing to be. You thought of Bethlehem, you didn't think of anything. You just thought, oh, there's just another town, just another place. But David came from there, and ultimately Jesus came from there. And because, again, God is not looking for the mightiest people. He's looking for the willingest people, the ones that have the will to do his work. And so then you find out there, and then you just keep going, and David killed those 100 Philistines and I'm sure that when he went back to Saul there, Saul might have been a little shocked when he found out that David actually came back and that Michal was actually going to have to be his wife. I'm sure he was pretty shocked about that, because Saul didn't think David could do it. And but continually the Lord continued to do the work there and continued to just work mightily in David. But verse 1 through 5, you find the allegiance that was formed. And Jonathan stripped himself of his robe that was upon him. And that signifies his position. That signifies who he was. That signifies that even though Jonathan understood that he was the king's son, even though Jonathan understood that he had every right to the throne, like I said before, he probably saw in David's life what God was doing. He probably had a little bit more of a pulse on the will of God than his father did, and he realized that it wasn't for him to have anymore. It wasn't his position anymore. He realized that God had come away from his father, and no doubt it was exemplified in every aspect of David's life that he was the man. And what I kind of want to get from this is, sometimes we might want to have the position. We might want to have where everybody looks at us and says, look at what they're doing. But it's not all the time for everybody to be in the forefront. And that's what Jonathan had to understand. Even though he had every right to all of this, he was going to take a back seat and let David and let God's will be done. He wasn't going to hinder what God had for the nation of Israel, even though he could have. He could have been just like his father, been upset with David, been mad at David, but instead of doing that, he chose to form an allegiance with him. So he strips himself of his position right there, of his robes, those king's garments. And then he goes and gave it to David. Now, again, we go back. David was just from Bethlehem. He didn't know. He was probably just looked like a shepherd. He probably just wore regular garments, regular things. And David, throughout this entire chapter, continuously goes back to that. I am nobody. I am just doing what I've been sent to do. And yet Jonathan put those upon David, signifying that I am no longer going to be the king. You are going to be the king. And then you find that Jonathan gave up his power. Because it's one thing, if I give somebody my robe, that's fine. But if I still have my weapons of war, I can still go back and take it. But Jonathan didn't quit with his position. He continued to go forth with his power. And he gave up his sword and his spirit. He gave up anything that could be brought back forth to maybe one day, maybe just because, for sake of argument, Jonathan just decided one day that he wanted to go back on what he had said. If he still had those weapons, he could go back and go back and forcefully take back what was rightfully his under the tradition of men. But instead, he gave up his power, gave up any ability to ever go back against David, and gave them to David. And then he gave up his pride, gave up all the things in his life. He humbled himself, and because it says his garments even and to his girdle. So he gave up his pride. He gave up anything in his life. He humbled himself. Unlike his father, he chose not to go after the will of his father, but he chose to go after the will of Christ. And what an awesome thing we see here. Jonathan just willingly giving up what nobody else probably would want to do, but just choosing rather to give up that and to watch David, his friend. I think about the verse, not wherewithal, that's the wrong verse. For scarcely for a righteous man would one die, yet peradventure for a good man some would even dare to die. But God committed his love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. It talks about how men would die. Greater love hath no man than this, than a man would lay down his life for his. That was the verse I was looking for. Then a man would lay down his life for his friend. Jonathan was basically laying down all of his future, all of his life for his friend, for somebody that wasn't a part of the royal lineage, wasn't a part of that, but he willingly just gave it up there. And I just find that's just a beautiful picture there of what Jonathan did with David and with his friend. And then we find, though, that Saul builds up animosity, and that was broken down in verse 6 through verse number 16, where again those women came in the city dancing to meet the king, and they talked about his 10,000s. Then what was ultimately the downfall of Saul? We know what it was. It was pride. Pride and arrogancy in the evil way do I hate, saith the Lord. Pride cometh before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. The Bible talks about how we're supposed to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God. We're supposed to set our affection on things above and not on things of the earth. But Saul, what ultimately was Saul's downfall was he went about, the Bible talks about how men established their own righteousness instead of submitting themselves to the righteousness which is of God. And Saul's downfall was when God told Saul to go and do a particular thing. Saul went and did everything that God said except for kill the animals. And why was that? So he could offer sacrifices. Was sacrificing the animals wrong? No. Was sacrificing a good thing to do? Absolutely. He was trying to worship God. What was the problem? He was worshiping God his own way. He disobeyed God and literally sacrificed animals in direct disobedience to what God had told him to do. And he did not submit himself. He established his own righteousness. He did the right thing the wrong way. There's a lot of times we might do the right thing, but there's a right and a wrong way to do the right thing a lot of times. Some people, maybe when you're having a conversation with somebody, you've got to be firm and bold and just right on top of somebody. My dad always used to say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. There's a right and a wrong way to do things, and Saul was worship God the right way, not the wrong way. Even though it was good to worship God, he did it his own way. He tried to establish his own righteousness, and because of that, because of that pride and that arrogance and just that haughty spirit in Saul's life, it caused animosity. I don't know about you, but there's been times where I've seen other people maybe getting more blessings than me. Maybe, it seems like God's really doing a work in their life. And instead of being happy for them, instead of being joyful and where they're at, I get upset because I begin looking. Why do I get upset? Because I'm looking at myself. I'm looking at, why isn't that happening to me? Why am not I getting those things? And that's what Saul was doing here. He was upset because people were seeing somebody else. They were looking at somebody else. He began to see that his popularity was going away in Israel. They were beginning to turn their eyes to David. They were beginning to see how great David was. And the saying displeased Saul in verse number 8. And they ascribed David as 10,000s. And to me, they ascribed but thousands, which is kind of crazy. I understand 10,000 is a lot more than thousands. But Saul said but thousands. He was so upset, even though he had done things, he was still just not happy with what all he had done. He didn't want anybody to ever look at anybody else. All he wanted was all the glory for himself. And Saul eyed David from that day forward with contempt. He was looking for every way to manipulate David. He was looking for every way to get a scheme to keep David from ever having all the power, ever having all the joy. And I think I did make the comment. I don't think Saul obviously did not know that David was to be the king, because he says, what else is there for David to take from me? He's already taken all my pride. He's already taken all my glory. What else is he going to take from me? The kingdom. And ultimately, that's what David was going to take from him. But David didn't take it from him. God took it from him. But all Saul could see was the outside because there was no spirituality left in Saul here. And so we find that animosity was just built up, and we just need to watch out for that in our lives. When somebody else, maybe it seems, I don't know about you, but sometimes, and this might not be a good illustration, but I'm going to use it anyway. Sometimes you'll be at work, and there'll be somebody that, they might not be the best at what they do. They might not be, you might look at them and say, how in the world are they getting promoted? How in the world are they getting these things when I've done more work, I've done more labor, I've been here more than they have, and yet that's the wrong mentality. It's the flesh's mentality to have, but it's not the right mentality to have, because David had no inherent right to what he was getting, but God gave it to him. And so we just need to watch out when people are just getting elevated to positions, and we just don't understand why. Just wait on God. God has a particular plan for you. It might not be in this moment when this other person it seems like is getting more than you or whatever. God has a plan for your life. We just have to keep on that track and just don't try to get ahead of God's will, which David never did that. David always submitted himself in the moment to whatever God had for him. When there was times he could have taken the kingdom, he did not. He didn't have animosity. He never had animosity towards Saul, which is so crazy to think about. He never had animosity towards Saul, even though Saul tried to kill him. Saul tried to manipulate him. Saul tried to take away his reputation. All of those things, David loved Saul, continued to love Saul. And that goes all the way contrary to any of definitely my mentality a lot of times in my flesh. When somebody does me wrong, I want to do them wrong right away. But when somebody does us wrong, we should be like Christ and forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's what God did for us. How much more should we be willing to do that for other people in our lives? But that we have to be filled with the Spirit in order to do that. So we find that Saul had a lot of animosity built up there. He just hated everything about David and what God was doing in David's life. And then you find the rest of the chapter, you find him making arrangements, and then he broke some of them and maintained some of them. And this is just the way I guess it worked back in those days. They had those arranged marriages, and I don't know what necessarily his goal was. Well, we know what his goal was. His goal was to become a hindrance to David. And obviously, most everybody in here has been married or is married, and some of us aren't. But if you are, I'm gonna take it back to just watch out for the people that come into your life. Because David was, it talks about how wise David was in all of his dealings and everything that he did. Just because somebody looks good, somebody talks right, somebody acts right, doesn't all the time mean that we need to let them into everything. Because there might be an ulterior motive in why the devil will send people in our way, in our life, to just distract us. It might not even be a big thing, just to distract us a little bit, which is all Saul was trying to do here. He was just trying to get David away from being all powerful, out of the might, out of all of his might there, by giving Michal to him for his wife, and all just basically to just cause a distraction in David's life, cause a distraction, something just to get a little bit in the way there that would become a hindrance to all that God wanted to do. And so he tried to arrange these things, and I think what it was is he wanted to keep a close eye on David, because he began to realize that there was something different about him. Everything that Saul had sent him out to do, he did it, and he did it very well. He did it better than anybody else in Israel. And it got to the point where Saul was even appointing him captains of the armies, which is where we're going to keep going through David's life. That's where a lot his mighty men came from. All of these people that were around him, all because of positions that they watched David. It says that David went in. The reason the people loved David was because he went in and out. It says in and out among the people. He didn't just sit in his palace, watch everybody else do the work, never mingle with the people. I think I dealt with this a little bit Thursday night about how our gospel should be. We should be affectionate, be caring about people. If we want to lead people to Christ, be great leaders in the ministry and the work of God, we have to go in and out amongst the people. Maybe some of them we might not even necessarily like all the time, but still be willing to go in and out amongst the people. And this is just a statement, if you ever want, and I've learned this, and I'm sure everybody in here has learned this, but if you ever want to help people, you have to be willing to be hurt. And it's the hardest thing in the world to do. I watched my dad, when he pastored his first church, I watched him go into these people. All he did was care for them. All he did was try to be affectionate toward them, give them whatever they needed. And the very end of it, all they did at the very end was just absolutely ridicule and shame my dad. But all he did was try to help him. And yet, that's the way a lot of times it's going to work. Sometimes it's going to be that way, but we just have to be like David, just continue to go in and out among the people, be willing to be hurt, be willing to be done wrong to, but there's going to be more people that we help as a result of that than that hurt us in the long run. Maybe not in the short run, but in the long run. And we need to be like David here, just to go in and out among the people, to be God's servant, to do God's will, not to do it our own way, but to do it his way. And it's just amazing just what you'll see God do in your life. It'll be almost like a mini story. David, it was a man after God's own heart. That's what ultimately is said about David. And we know that David, in the end of his life, made a lot of mistakes, did a lot of things the wrong way, and yet God still said that he was a man after his own heart, because David continuously, even when he failed, even when he messed up, he went right back to the Lord and said, Lord, I'm so sorry. He repented. He turned away from what he had done wrong. He realized what he had done, and he turned away from those things and just continued to follow after Christ, continued to try to do the best that he could to just continue to live in the will of his Father. And ultimately, Michal, we'll find out, while she did have a lot of flaws, she ultimately did love David a whole lot. She loved David even in contradiction to what her father even wanted. I think it may be in chapter number 19. I don't want to get there today. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, and so I'm not going to go into it. But Saul, I think, got a little worried because he probably saw that his plan wasn't quite working either with Michal and David. Now, she did become a little bit of a hindrance to him later on, but Michal ultimately saved his life in the next story that we're going to find. But Saul got upset about that. Even the arrangement that he thought would work, even the arrangement that he thought would distract David, still could not distract David, because David had God on his side. David was going to be the king because David was anointed by God himself. And then the Philistines went forth at the end of the chapter, and it came to pass after they went forth that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was much set by. And so just this chapter 18, is just, we find allegiance formed. Jonathan just took everything that he rightfully had and gave it to David. And that's what we should be. We should be willing to, whatever it is in our lives, to just lay it aside and just give it to God. Just give it to God. Let God do his will in our life. Take away our power. Take away what we want, our desires, our fleshly desires, and just give it to God and watch God do a work through us, through just our humbling ourselves before God. And then just to be careful about animosity being built up in our life, because that's an easy thing to happen. Animosity, you won't even have to think about it. It's just natural. That's what you want to do. It's just the natural man just wants to do somebody wrong when they do us wrong. But the spiritual man, the spirit-filled man, will be able to not allow that work to be done in him, of that animosity, of that work to be done. And then just to watch out for things, to be vigilant. The Bible says to be sober, be vigilant, because the adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. Watch out for the people that come into your life and figure out why they're there. Just don't let any one person become a distraction to you. Just make sure that you're able to just rest in the finished work of God and just continue to go forward, continue to keep on going. And ultimately, David's name was, at the very end of this chapter, it was much set by. And I just love that about David. Every time Saul tried to offer him his daughter, and even Jonathan, his friend, every time that would happen, all David could think of was, I'm a nobody. I am nothing. I'm from nothing. I'm just a shepherd's son, a shepherd boy. All I'm doing here is just doing what my father told me to do. I'm just being obedient to the will of God, and all of the other things will just take place. But if we let ourselves take over and our pride take over, then we'll become like Saul. And ultimately, Saul ended up in a very depressed state. And ultimately, David's harp used to calm his soul, calm his mind. And it got to the point where even that didn't calm him anymore. Even that point, all because Saul started out with that pride and then ended up just bitterness. And I think they talk about bitterness being the poison that you want to poison somebody else with, but it ends up killing yourself. And that's all bitterness will ever do to somebody, is it'll kill you. All that hate, all that animosity you have towards somebody else, ultimately, in the end, all it does is hurt you more than it ever will the other person most of the time. And so we just need to watch out for that. And I know I need to work on getting a little bit longer with my lessons. I'm going to try to do a little bit longer. But that's just really what I have for you this morning. That's 1 Samuel chapter number 18. And then next time we're going to go to verse number 19, and we're going to see where David's life was spared by Jonathan and by Michael. Michael, yeah, Michael, Saul's daughter, and how that his life was spared all because he was doing the will of God. And God's will be done. God's will always be done, no matter the opposition, no matter the obstacles, as long as we don't get in the way of allowing it to take place in our lives. That's all I have this morning. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Lord, thank you for the opportunity again to open your book. Thank you for all that's in there. There's so much in your book, Lord, and we just thank you for allowing us to read it, to be a part of it. Lord, just help us this morning as we go about the service. Pray that you just bring people in, draw people to yourself. Lord, if there's one here lost this morning that doesn't know you, they'd be saved from the knowledge of the truth, and you'd be with Brother Hardiman as he preaches. Be with Brother Chris as he preaches over there in Sevierville this morning, Lord, and just do a mighty work, dear God, through him and through this church and through that church this morning. And thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. You are at liberty. Yeah. I know. I need to slow down.